We do not live in the world humans evolved to live in. This is not a lament, but a cold, concise observation. Yet, it is enough to shake the belief that modern society is the inevitable and perfect destination of human history. The book, The World Until Yesterday, by Jared Diamond, begins with a seemingly minor observation. Contemporary humans can stand next to hundreds of strangers in an airport without fear. But rewind just a little in evolutionary time, and such a thing would have been impossible. For most of their history, humans lived in small groups where every face was familiar, every action remembered, and every mistake carried long-lasting consequences. This book does not romanticize the past as a wild frontier, nor does it judge the present. It places two worlds side by side: the world of traditional societies, where people lived without states, written laws, or police, and the modern world where order is ensured by institutions, technology, and anonymous distances. From this stark comparison, uncomfortable questions arise. Why are modern humans safer yet more anxious? Why do they live longer but often feel more isolated? Why are children more protected yet more fragile in the face of mental pressure? And why do so many contemporary problems stem not from individual weakness, but from a fundamental mismatch between our evolutionary biology and our new living environment? The book doesn't offer advice on how to live. It does something much harder. It forces the reader to re-examine what is currently considered obvious: how humans raise children, resolve conflicts, confront old age, danger, belief, language, and health. Each domain bears the trace of a very long past that the present has only touched for a fleeting moment. The question isn't whether we should return to yesterday. The question is, in our relentless push forward, what mechanisms that once helped us survive, connect, and understand ourselves have we left behind? And could anything from that past still hold value if re-examined with a more discerning eye? If the modern world isn't the final answer, then what is the question this book compels us to confront? Now, let's dive into the review of this book. The airport in the morning is bustling with hundreds of unfamiliar faces standing close together, waiting their turn. No one is wary, no one is preparing for a fight, and no one needs to know who the person next to them is. This scene seems so obvious that we forget that for almost all of human history, it would have been an impossibility. The modern world allows people to stand next to strangers without fear, and this very fact leads us to mistakenly believe it's our natural state. In reality, it's a very late invention. For most of our evolutionary journey, humans lived in small groups where every face had a name, every relationship a history, and every transgression carried lasting consequences. There was no concept of an anonymous crowd, no neutral space, no crossing someone else's territory without leaving a trace. The world then was divided not by maps, but by relationships. Land was not owned in an absolute, exclusive sense, but neither was it ownerless common property. The right to use land depended on history, kinship, exchange, and implicit agreements, which could change with seasons, famines, marriages, or alliances. In such a world, people learned to classify others very early on, not by nationality, but by their level of safety: friends, enemies, and strangers. Friends were those with shared history, reciprocal debts, memories of help, and forgiveness. Enemies were those who had caused harm and for whom reconciliation had not occurred. Strangers, however, were different. Strangers weren't necessarily bad, but they always posed a risk because no one knew what they would do, where they came from, or what unspoken feuds they carried. In a society without police or written law, assuming safety was a fatal mistake. Therefore, what the modern world calls freedom of movement was once a rare luxury. People didn't wander aimlessly. Every journey required a reason, an introduction, or an intermediary relationship. No one simply dropped by without social repercussions. Even encounters between groups often involved rituals, gifts, or identifying markers to prevent misunderstandings that could lead to violence. From this need for survival, an important social invention emerged: exchange. Exchange didn't begin as economics, it began as a way to survive. Exchange was the method of transforming strangers into acquaintances, a fragile bridge connecting two groups who otherwise had reason to fear each other. An object exchanged carried not only utilitarian value, but also a message: I come in peace. I acknowledge your existence. I accept future obligations. In many traditional societies, refusing an exchange was not simply refusing goods, but refusing a relationship, and that was a dangerous act. These exchange networks from the outside might have seemed small and fragmented, but when mapped, they reveal connections stretching hundreds, even thousands of kilometers, where seashells, precious stones, bird feathers, or metal tools passed through many groups. Each handover strengthened a relationship without currency, without contracts, but with collective memory and honor. In a world without banks, reputation was the greatest asset. However, exchange did not completely eliminate conflict. Accidents still happened, and death still came, sometimes not from malice but from a moment of carelessness. And when that happened in a society where everyone would continue to encounter each other for the rest of their lives, the question wasn't who was right or wrong, but how do we prevent tomorrow from becoming an endless cycle of revenge? It is at this point that the logic of the old world reveals a profound difference from the modern world. There, justice was not separate from daily life. It was not handed over to an anonymous institution. It unfolded before the community, with the participation of those who would collectively bear the consequences. The goal was not punishment, but the restoration of the ability to coexist. Compensation was not to buy silence, but to acknowledge loss and re-establish the fragile balance that had been broken. With nowhere to hide, reconciliation became a condition for survival. But if reconciliation failed, the only path left was violence. And when there was no central power with a monopoly on the use of force, violence did not stop at a single act. It spread, accumulated, transforming into generations-long chains of conflict. Small wars, seemingly harmless due to low casualties, actually depleted society persistently and cruelly. It is from this foundation that the great paradox of the world, until yesterday, gradually emerges. It was a world deeply connected, but by no means peaceful. People knew each other, needed each other, and therefore also had a greater capacity to harm each other. As we step into the modern world, violence decreases, but along with it comes the disintegration of the personal ties that once held society together. And from that fragile point of connection, the story will continue to delve deeper into how humans resolve conflict when reconciliation is no longer enough to keep them together. The pathways of exchange were formed. When strangers were no longer solely a threat, but became potential partners, traditional society entered a state of fragile balance. This balance was not based on written laws, but on memory and the recurrence of encounters. Everyone knew they would continue to see that face for many more years, perhaps for a lifetime. This compelled people to think beyond a moment of anger. In that world, accidents were inevitable. A spear veering off course, a child running out at the wrong time, a branch breaking while felling a tree. When death occurred without malice, society did not immediately ask who was right or wrong. The first question was always how to prevent this death from spawning more deaths, because if left unaddressed, pain would turn into hatred, and hatred would seek revenge. The way traditional societies reacted to such deaths often bewilders modern people. There was no criminal investigation, no cold legal conclusion. Instead, there was a gathering of the community, prolonged discussions, rituals, tears, and silence. Compensation emerged not as a punishment, but as an acknowledgement of loss. It didn't erase the pain, but it communicated that the pain was seen, valued, and not denied. In that logic, the value of compensation lay not in the quantity of wealth, but in the message. The person who caused the accident and their group accepted a share of the consequence. The group that lost a loved one accepted that their pain was not disregarded. The community witnessed this process to ensure that the relationship was not permanently broken. The ultimate goal was not abstract justice, but the ability to continue living side by side without sleeping in fear of retribution. This mechanism could only exist in societies where people could not simply vanish after an act. There was nowhere to hide, no distant city to start over with a new name. Social memory acted as a moral archiving system, where every action was remembered not through documents, but through stories and attitudes. Honor, in this context, was not an abstract concept but a condition for existence. When juxtaposing this mechanism with the modern justice system, the differences become stark. In today's world, justice is entrusted to an intermediary structure. The parties don't need to know each other or even look each other in the eye. The state resolves conflicts on behalf of the community, with standardized laws, strict procedures, and the goal of determining right from wrong and then punishing. This system brings order on a large scale, but simultaneously separates justice from the emotional lives of those involved. This detachment comes at a cost. Many conflicts end with a verdict, but not with healing. Parties leave feeling they have won or lost, rather than having understood each other better. In societies where strangers are the majority, this might be acceptable. But in societies where people must live next to each other for life, a legal victory can be the seed of a long-term disaster. However, one should not idealize the old world. Reconciliation mechanisms only worked when all parties were willing to accept them. When emotions surpassed tolerance, when compensation was refused, when a death was perceived not as an accident but as an insult, traditional society had no second layer of protection, no force to halt the spiral of revenge. From here, the path to violence opened rapidly. The danger of violence in that world lay not in its immediate scale, but in its chain reaction. One act led to another, one death dragged another. Revenge needed no new reason, it fed itself. And in societies without a monopoly on the use of force, there was no concept of enough. Violence could extend through generations, becoming part of the collective memory. It is at this boundary that traditional society reveals a profound paradox. It forged incredibly tight personal bonds, but when those bonds broke, the consequences were unchecked. People were both protected by the community and imprisoned within that very network of relationships, with no neutrality, no safe distance. And from here, the story slides into a more difficult reality to accept. Violence was not an exception in the old world, it was a constant possibility. Conflicts, seemingly small and involving few people, were precisely where the fragile nature of stateless life was most clearly revealed. To understand this, one must look directly at warfare, not the warfare of nations, but the warfare of groups who knew very well whom they were killing. After discussing revenge conflicts and the cycle of violence in the old world, another question gradually emerges, more silently but no less harsh. When humans were not killed by enemies, they still faced another challenge. How could a fragile being survive in an environment always fraught with danger? The birth of a child in traditional society was never a given. It always came with worry, caution, and choices driven by survival rather than emotion. In that world, childbirth did not occur in sterile rooms, nor was there a medical safety net. Women gave birth amid scarcity, with high mortality rates for both mother and child. Therefore, traditional society did not view having many children as something romantic. Childbearing was regulated by accumulated experience over generations, by long birth intervals, by extended breastfeeding, and by delaying the next pregnancy until the mother's body had fully recovered. These decisions were not enshrined in law, but deeply etched into daily habits. Life in the old world did not begin with planning, nor with perfect preparation. It began amidst ongoing life. Childbirth was not a separate event, but an integrated part of labor, hunting, gathering, and relationships that had existed long before. A child born did not enter a sterile room, but stepped directly into the rhythm of community life. There was no handover from medicine to family. New life emerged right among the people who would coexist with it. In that world, birth always carried risk. This was not hidden. The death of a mother or infant was a constant possibility. Thus, birth was not romanticized, but precisely because of its danger, it was never an individual burden. When a woman gave birth, it was not just her story. Those around her knew they were participating in the survival of their community. From the moment a child was born, the way it was nurtured deeply reflected human evolutionary history. Infants were rarely put down alone. They were held, carried, and had almost continuous physical contact. Crying was not ignored to teach self-soothing. It was seen as a signal requiring a response, not because children were pampered, but because in an environment without inherent safety, an unusually silent child was alarming. Breastfeeding was not scheduled. It happened on demand. The child nursed when needed, not when a timetable allowed. Breastfeeding was not just nutrition, but also nervous system soothing. This continued for many years, leading to late weaning and naturally longer birth intervals, not due to modern family planning, but because the mother's body reacted directly to survival conditions. Reproduction was regulated not by consciousness, but by physiology and environment. A child did not have just one caregiver. Nurturing was a diffused responsibility, spread across many hands: mother, father, older siblings, relatives, other women in the group. Children were passed from one person to another, learning to adapt to multiple voices, rhythms, and ways of responding. This created a foundation of safety not dependent on a single individual. When one person was tired, another took over. When one was absent, the network remained. From a biological perspective, this produced a generation that grew up with lower baseline stress. The child didn't need to constantly self-soothe in isolation because the surrounding environment was always responsive. Primitive survival reflexes were satisfied early and consistently. This didn't make children weak. On the contrary, it allowed their nervous system to develop in a stable state instead of constant alert. As the child grew older, it was not separated from the adult world. There was no rigid boundary between the child's world and the adult's world. Children observed everything: labor, arguments, reconciliation, play, sorrow. No one sat down to formally teach. Children learned by watching, by imitating, by participating in small parts suited to their abilities. Learning was neither forced nor delayed. Children's freedom in that world was much greater than modern people might imagine. They gained autonomy early, making many small decisions related to themselves. But that freedom did not occur in a vacuum. It existed in a space where every action was seen. Direct supervision was not needed because the community's gaze was always present. Discipline did not come from frequent physical punishment. It came from social reactions, from shame, from knowing that one's actions were witnessed and would be remembered. Children did not grow up in age-segregated groups. Multi-age groups created a natural learning order. Younger children observed older children. Older children learned to care for and guide. Competition was softened by differences in roles. Cooperation became an essential skill, not an abstract moral lesson. When all this is placed alongside modern child-rearing practices, a difficult truth emerges. Modern society has separated children from the evolutionary context that created them. The nuclear family, rigid schedules, age segregation, and isolation inadvertently create an entirely new environment to which humans have not had enough time to fully adapt. From this point, the story does not stop with children. These children will grow up, age, and then become another societal question. By what measure will human value be determined when physical strength declines? And that is where the stream of thought continues to slide into a more difficult phase, where life is no longer a beginning but an extension within the fragile limits of time. The children growing up in that world were not taught that they were learning. Learning was not separated from life, nor was it framed into fixed hours. It happened when children saw adults working, heard them arguing, observed how a mistake was corrected, or how a conflict was diffused. Children learned by being near, by being allowed to try, and by enduring just enough consequences to understand their limits. In that environment, children were not separated from adults, so they did not develop a parallel world. They knew how dangerous hunting was. They knew fire could cook food but also burn down a shelter. They knew words could heal but also wound. These lessons came not from lectures but from direct witnessing. Truth was not shielded. It was introduced gradually, according to the child's capacity to absorb. The way children learned reflected a profound assumption of traditional society. Children were not creatures to be tightly controlled to become good, but rather individuals learning to regulate their behavior within a real network of relationships. When a child did something wrong, the first reaction was rarely punishment. It was often an uncomfortable silence, a glance, a brief reminder. The child understood that their action had created a social ripple, and that ripple itself was the lesson. Physical punishment, contrary to many stereotypes, was not as common as modern people might imagine, not because that society was more humane, but because it didn't need frequent punishment. When children knew they couldn't escape the community, that their reputation would follow them for years, even a lifetime social pressure was already strong enough to regulate behavior. Shame, in this context, was not meant to humiliate, but to remind the child of the connection they were a part of. Another important factor was multi-age peer groups. Younger children learned not only from adults, but also from older children. Older children learned patience, protection, and guidance. Younger children learned to observe, wait, and imitate. This structure softened direct competition because each child had their own place in the learning hierarchy. Rivalry was not constantly stimulated as in same-age groups, where everyone is measured by the same yardstick. Children's freedom in that world was real, but it wasn't aimless freedom. Children were allowed to wander, but knew their limits. They climbed, explored, and took risks just enough to understand their bodies and environment. When slightly injured, it wasn't a failure of the caregiver, but part of the learning process. Danger was not completely eliminated, because if it were, children would not learn how to identify and avoid it. This parenting style produced adults accustomed to self-regulation, accustomed to observing social reactions, and accustomed to taking responsibility for their actions within a specific community. Maturity came not from blind obedience, but from the ability to read context and people. This was a vital skill in a world without written laws and centralized coercive mechanisms. When juxtaposing this model with modern society, the difference lies not in intention but in structure. Children today are meticulously protected, age-segregated, and educated in separate spaces with rules imposed from outside. The consequence is not always psychological safety, but sometimes prolonged dependence and difficulty in self-regulation when stepping out of a controlled environment. This difference is not an indictment but an observation. Modern society chooses safety and efficiency on a large scale. Traditional society chooses early integration and learning through direct experience. Each choice has its price. And as these children grow up, carrying the skills shaped by their environment, society must confront another equally harsh question. When strength declines, when speed slows, when the body is no longer the primary tool, what will keep people included? These children grew up, carrying a worldview shaped by early integration. Society then began to enter the second half of the life cycle. The question was no longer how to become an adult, but how to continue to be meaningful as strength declined in the old world. Old age was not defined by numbers. It was defined by the ability to contribute and by one's position within the network of relationships. There was no single way of treating the elderly. Traditional societies were incredibly diverse in their perceptions of old age. In some places, the elderly were kept at the center of life. They were living repositories of memory, the ones who remembered the best hunting seasons, the safest paths, how to avoid a disaster that had occurred years ago. When the world had no writing, human memory was the library. Losing an elder meant losing a part of collective history. In such societies, the value of the elderly lay not in their labor but in their experience. They didn't run faster, but they saw further. When a decision was made, their voice was not a command but a reminder of past consequences. The presence of elders helped the community avoid repeating old mistakes, and in a risky environment, that could save lives. But there were also societies that made harsher choices. When resources were scarce, when migration was compulsory, when every mouth to feed put pressure on the group, the elderly might be abandoned or even killed. This is something that modern people react to violently. But in the logic of the old world, such decisions were not made out of individual cruelty. They stemmed from a collective survival problem, where keeping one person alive could endanger the entire group. It is important to understand that in these societies, the elderly often participated in those decisions. It was not always an act of coercion. Many elders chose not to prolong their existence if it threatened their descendants. Individual value was dissolved into community value. Life was not considered an absolute right of an individual, but a part of a collective balance. In comparing this to modern society, another paradox emerges. Today, people live longer than ever before. Medicine extends lifespan, and social welfare ensures material existence. But old age often comes with isolation. The elderly no longer hold a central role in community life. Their experience is replaced by technology, data, and specialization. Life is prolonged, but social meaning shrinks. In the old world, the elderly might die earlier, but while alive, they were rarely invisible. In the new world, the elderly might live long but easily become outsiders. The question is not which society is more humane, but which society allows people to feel they still belong to something when their strength has peaked. From old age, the stream of thought shifts to a broader theme encompassing all aspects of life: danger in traditional societies. Danger was not a rare occurrence in traditional societies, it was the default state of existence. Accidents, wild animals, disease, famine, violence, all could happen at any time. There were no early warning systems, no insurance, no safety buffers. Therefore, people developed a different attitude towards life. Vigilance was not seen as anxiety but as wisdom. Walking carefully at night, thoroughly checking when crossing a stream, stopping if a strange sound was heard. Behaviors that modern society might consider overly cautious were, in that world, conditions for survival. This state of alertness did not lead to continuous panic. It was integrated into daily life. People learned to avoid small risks to prevent paying a big price. Danger was not denied but anticipated. Preparation was not dramatic but repetitive and persistent. As modern society gradually eliminates immediate dangers, an unwanted consequence emerges. People become more complacent. The instinct for prevention weakens. Safety creates an illusion of invulnerability, making new risks less obvious and harder to identify in time. From this, another fragile form of existence is created. Danger became the default state of life. Humans had no privilege of oblivion. Constructive vigilance was not blind fear, but a set of small habits repeated regularly to reduce the probability of error. No one waited for danger to strike before reacting. Every move was considered beforehand. Every decision had a contingency plan, not because people were pessimistic, but because the environment did not allow for unconditional optimism. In those communities, accidents were not called accidents in the sense of randomness. They were the result of a chain of choices, and thus one could learn from them. When someone was injured by slipping on a wet rock, the story didn't end with the injury. It was retold, remembered, and passed on as a warning. Collective memory functioned as a rudimentary but effective safety system where every individual mistake became a shared lesson. This vigilance extended to all aspects of life: hunting, canoeing, setting up camp, approaching an injured animal. Avoiding small risks to prevent paying a large price was a consistent principle. Reckless individuals were not admired, they were seen as a threat to the entire group. In a society where one person's mistake could lead to the death of many, prudence was a moral virtue. Illness was also viewed within the same logical framework. There was no separation between the body and the environment. People did not believe they were immune, so they carefully observed unusual signs, avoided contact when necessary, and changed behavior according to seasons and food sources. When disease spread, the reaction was not just to treat it, but to adjust lifestyles to reduce transmission. Adaptation occurred before a complete explanation was available. Famine, when it happened, was not seen as a sudden shock. It was an anticipated possibility. Therefore, society developed many parallel strategies: dispersing food sources, diversifying diet, storing when possible, and moving when necessary. No single strategy guaranteed absolute safety, but their combination reduced overall risk. Survival did not rely on a single solution. All of this created a type of competence that modern society rarely needs: the ability to live with risk without being paralyzed. People did not live in panic, but neither did they lull themselves into assumed safety. Each day brought silent preparation for the next. When juxtaposing this with modern life, the difference becomes sharp. Today, many immediate dangers have been eliminated. Accidents are down, life expectancy is up, and protection systems are expanded. But this safety comes with an evolutionary price. Humans gradually lose the habit of reading signs, losing the ability to anticipate the long-term consequences of new risks that don't manifest immediately. Danger doesn't disappear, it merely changes form in the new world. Risk rarely appears as wild animals or famine. It appears as accumulated habits, repeated choices, and slow consequences. Complacency becomes a form of invisible danger. When no longer needing to be vigilant with every step, people easily believe they are safe in all contexts, until they realize that modern risks do not announce themselves with sounds or clear tracks. Traditional society was not safer, but it produced people who knew how to live with uncertainty. Modern society is safer on the surface, but at the cost of weakening the adaptive mechanisms that helped humans survive for tens of thousands of years. There are no simple conclusions, no perfect models. What remains is a sober awareness. Safety is not a permanent state, but a balance that must be maintained through understanding and vigilance. When humans forget this, they do not become freer. They only become vulnerable in a different, way more subtle, slower, and harder to recognize. And when humans have learned how not to kill each other, how to be born, grow up, age, and survive in a world full of risks, there is still a large void left unfilled: the void of meaning. Humans cannot endure living in a world of pure randomness. An illness, a sudden death, a failed hunting season, if all is mere chance, then fear becomes uncontrollable. And it is from that point that humans began to create explanations beyond what the eyes could see or the hands could touch. In traditional societies, before science existed as a system, every important event required a cause that could be narrated, not to prove, but to continue living. When someone fell ill, the question wasn't which bacteria caused it, but what was violated: a word, an action, a relationship. The world was understood as an invisible moral network where events were inseparable from people. Beliefs in spirits, deities, and unseen forces did not arise because humans were irrational. They arose because humans needed a strong enough explanatory framework to endure uncertainty. When causes could not be directly observed, people created causes that could be told as stories. These stories helped put fear into an order. They allowed people to believe that the world, however harsh, still had a logic. Supernatural beliefs, therefore, not only answered the question, why, but also, what to do. Believing that some force was watching, people adjusted their behavior even when no one else saw. Belief created a sense of continuous surveillance, but without needing any specific person to do the watching. In small societies where everyone knew each other, this subtly reinforced social order. More importantly, belief alleviated anxiety when disaster struck. It was no longer a blind blow. It became a signal, perhaps a warning, perhaps a punishment, perhaps a lesson. Meaning did not make disaster disappear, but it made disaster bearable. And in a world without a social safety net, this capacity for endurance was vital. It is easy to misunderstand these beliefs as being opposed to reason. In the context of the traditional world, they were a rational adaptive response. Without data, without experiments, without statistics, relying on collective experience and transmitted stories was the best way to reduce risk. A wrong but stable belief was sometimes safer than a truth not fully understood. As society expanded, individual beliefs gradually connected into systems. Belief was no longer just for explaining the world, but began to organize people. Shared stories created common boundaries. Shared rituals created a sense of belonging. Participating in a ritual was not just an act of faith, but a declaration that one was part of the community. Those who conformed were trusted. Those who refused became suspect. In this context, belief acted as a form of public commitment. It allowed people to trust each other beyond individual relationships. When communities grew larger than everyone knowing everyone, signs of commitment became necessary. Praying together, abstaining from certain things together, following invisible rules together. These created coordination without needing continuous coercion. When viewed from the outside, these belief systems might seem irrational. But when placed in the environment that gave birth to them, they operated as sophisticated social technology. They reduced conflict, increased cooperation, and created the capacity for collective action in difficult circumstances. They were not perfect. They could be abused, but they were not random products. In the modern world, science has replaced many explanatory functions of belief, but the need for meaning does not disappear. When old questions are answered with data, new questions emerge, and humans continue to seek frameworks of meaning to place themselves within. The difference lies not in the presence or absence of belief, but in its form and function in life. From this point, the story cannot stop at personal meaning. As belief spreads, it begins to shape collective behavior, morality, and even power. What once helped individuals endure uncertainty gradually becomes a tool for social organization. And it is there that belief takes on another role, deeper, stronger, and with more consequences. Belief transcends the boundaries of individual experience. It is no longer just a story for self-assurance. Belief becomes a social structure. It begins to organize people, define right from wrong, and allow the community to act as a unified whole. In traditional societies, where the social scale had grown beyond everyone knowing everyone, this was vital. Rituals appeared not to beautify spiritual life, but to transform belief into visible action. When people participated in a ritual together, they not only showed reverence, but also sent a clear signal that they accepted common rules. The repetition of rituals created a social rhythm. It reminded everyone that they were not alone, that their actions were situated within an order larger than themselves. In small societies where every action was directly observed, morality was maintained by memory and relationships. But as society expanded, it could not rely entirely on individual supervision. Belief filled that void. When people believed that an unseen force was watching, behavior was regulated even in the absence of the community. Compliance did not require continuous coercion because it had been internalized. From here, morality was no longer just an implicit agreement, but became a sacred norm. Taboos, codes of conduct, obligations were justified not only by immediate benefits, but by the order of the world. This was especially important in how people treated strangers. Without a shared history, common belief became the minimum foundation for mutual trust. Belief was also closely tied to power. When a community needed to make difficult collective decisions, invoking a higher order helped reduce internal conflict. Decisions were no longer individual wills, but were presented as adherence to a principle beyond human agency. This could create stability, but also pave the way for abuse. Belief was both the glue that bound and a tool that could be exploited. In the context of war and conflict, this role became even clearer. Belief could mobilize, legitimize, and sustain collective action in circumstances where singular individual interests were not strong enough. When actions were imbued with sacred meaning, people were willing to endure greater sacrifices. This does not make belief good or bad. It merely shows its organizational power in human history. It is noteworthy that the function of belief changes with social scale. In small groups, it primarily reduced anxiety and maintained harmony. As society grew, belief became a social technology, helping to manage relationships that exceeded individual memory capacity. It created a common language of commitment that allowed hundreds or thousands of people to coordinate without knowing each other well. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to judge these structures by today's rational standards. But in the context that gave birth to them, they were effective adaptive solutions. They did not eliminate conflict, but made it controllable. They did not create absolute fairness, but created the capacity for collective action under conditions of limited information and high uncertainty. The difference of modern times lies in the fact that many of these organizational functions have been transferred to secular institutions. Law, administration, and science now assume roles that belief once held. But this replacement does not completely eliminate the need for signs of commitment and shared meaning. It merely changes their form. Humans still seek to identify who is an insider, who shares the same rules, who is trustworthy. From belief and ritual, the story gradually shifts to another tool, no less important in maintaining and expanding society: language. Because when people not only need to believe in the same order, but also need to communicate across different boundaries, language becomes an essential bridge. And in the old world, linguistic diversity was not an obstacle but a sophisticated form of adaptation. As society expanded and relationships extended beyond direct acquaintance, language became a survival tool no less than belief in traditional societies. There was no assumption that each person spoke only one language. Multilingualism was the norm, not the exception. People learned languages because they needed to communicate, to negotiate, to avoid conflict. Each language opened a door to a relationship, a safe passage. In small communities geographically dispersed, languages changed rapidly and diversely. A river, a mountain range, a swampy area could be enough to separate two groups and create two different ways of speaking. This dispersion was not a sign of backwardness, but a natural consequence of living in small social networks where communication primarily occurred within the group, and understanding outsiders required deliberate effort. Therefore, knowing multiple languages was a core social skill. It allowed people to negotiate when tensions rose, exchange when necessary, and diffuse misunderstandings before they escalated into violence. In many contexts, speaking another's language was not just polite but a declaration of goodwill. It said, "I am willing to step into your space. I accept learning to see the world your way." Language did not just convey information, it carried a way of classifying the world. Concepts of time, space, relationships, and responsibility were all encoded in speech. When a language disappeared, it was not just the loss of a means of communication, but the loss of a way of understanding life that had been refined over generations. Knowledge about the environment, seasons, and local dangers was often encapsulated in words and expressions difficult to translate fully into another language. In traditional societies, the disappearance of a language was often linked to the disintegration of a community. When a group of people was displaced, assimilated, or absorbed into a larger social structure, their language gradually gave way to the dominant language. This transition could bring pragmatic benefits, such as broader communication and access to greater resources, but it also entailed a silent, immeasurable loss. When compared to modern society, monolingualism emerges as an efficient choice. A common language facilitates management, education, and commerce, operating smoothly. But this efficiency comes at a cost. Thinking is compressed into familiar patterns, the subtle nuances of local experience are flattened. People communicate more easily, but sometimes understand each other less due to a lack of diverse frameworks to approach differences. In the Old World, multilingualism did not cause chaos. It created the ability to flexibly switch between contexts. A person might speak differently when addressing someone within their group and differently when speaking to an outsider. This ability helped people adjust their behavior, reduce friction, and build bridges between irreducible differences. When language is standardized, that ability to switch weakens. People share a vocabulary but gradually lose the skill of subtle context reading. Misunderstanding no longer comes from not understanding words, but from understanding the hidden meaning behind words differently. This is a new, subtle, but persistent form of fragility in large societies. Looking back, language in traditional society was not a barrier, but an adaptive tool. It allowed small societies to coexist, both separate and connected. Linguistic richness reflected the richness of ways of life. When a way of life disappeared, the accompanying language also vanished, leaving a void not easily filled by mere efficiency. The stream of thought returns to the origin of all experience, the human body. For no matter how much belief and language organize society, ultimately, humans still live in a body shaped by evolution. And it is there, in the relationship between old biology and a new environment, that the sharpest modern paradoxes begin to emerge. Even after all social structures have been built with belief and language, humans still cannot escape the most fundamental limitation. The human body evolved for a world of scarcity, not for a world of abundance. Our entire physiology was formed under conditions of prolonged deprivation, where every calorie was precious, every physical effort vital. In that context, what are today considered vices were once advantages. Salt, sugar, and fat were rare resources, and the body was programmed to crave them. When encountered, there was no reason to moderate consumption in an environment where tomorrow might bring nothing. At the same time, conserving energy was a survival strategy, not a blameworthy laziness. Being less active when unnecessary helped humans survive extended periods of food scarcity. In traditional society, these reflexes operated in a suitable environment. Food was not abundant, and physical labor was a condition for existence. The balance between physiology and environment was maintained naturally. Chronic diseases related to excess were rare, not because the body was different, but because circumstances had never exceeded the threshold of adaptation. When humans shifted to a modern lifestyle, the environment changed faster than our evolutionary capacity. Energy-dense foods became cheap and abundant, and physical labor drastically declined. The reflexes that once helped humans survive began to turn against them. The body still craved, still stored, still conserved energy, but the environment no longer imposed natural limits. The result is a range of diseases that appeared and spread. Diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease are not random phenomena. They are the consequence of a mismatch between evolutionary biology and the new environment. It is crucial to understand that this is not an individual failure. The human body was not designed to resist continuous excess. Blaming willpower only obscures the true origin of the problem. Examples from traditional societies transitioning to modern lifestyles show that this change occurs very rapidly. When diet and daily life change, the incidence of chronic diseases skyrockets within just 1 or 2 generations. This cannot be explained by genetics. It shows how powerfully the environment shapes health, far exceeding individual choices. This realization leads to an important conclusion. Modern health cannot rely solely on moral advice or individual discipline. It requires systemic adjustment of the living environment to be more compatible with human biology. Understanding evolutionary origins does not make the problem disappear, but it opens up possibilities for more practical and sustainable interventions. Looking back at the entire journey from violence, nurturing, old age, danger, belief, language, to the body, a red thread emerges. Many problems of modern society are not because humans are incompetent, but because society has succeeded too quickly. We have created a world that far exceeds the conditions for which our bodies and minds were formed to adapt. This does not lead to a call to return to the past. The old world was not a paradise, and its price was immense. But understanding that world helps us recognize what has been left behind, not to lament, but to make more conscious choices. By knowing where we come from, humans have a better chance to decide where they are going. This is the natural closing point of this journey, not a moral conclusion, nor a formula for living. Just a sober reminder that our present is built on the foundation of tens of thousands of years of evolution, and every step forward requires dialogue with that foundation rather than its denial. As this journey concludes, what remains is not nostalgia for a lost world, but a rare sobriety. This book does not teach how to live better in a moral sense, nor does it offer a model to copy. It does something much harder. It forces people to look directly at their own origins and accept that many things we consider normal are actually choices from only the last few hundred years. The biggest lesson is not whether traditional society was right or wrong. It lies in this paradox. We are living safer, longer, more comfortably, but we often feel more tired, isolated, and disoriented. Not because humans are weaker, but because the environment has changed faster than the adaptive capacity of our bodies, minds, and social relationships. Many modern stresses are not personal failures, but signs of a deep mismatch between evolutionary biology and contemporary life. The book also reminds us that humans do not live by food and security alone. We live by meaning, by connection, by the feeling of belonging to something greater than ourselves. When these things are completely replaced by efficiency, speed, and convenience, the price is not immediate, but accumulates slowly and persistently. So the question is not whether we should return to the past. The question is, in this modern world, what are we retaining of human nature, and what are we unknowingly abandoning? Are we raising children according to their needs or according to the rhythm of the system? Are we extending lifespan or merely prolonging existence? Are we truly safer or just less aware of danger? If you've listened this far, pause for a moment and ask yourself, in your daily life, is there anything that makes you tired, not because it's too difficult, but because it's too unfamiliar with how humans were designed to live? And if given the choice, what would you adjust first? If these thoughts resonate with you, please leave a comment. No need to be right or wrong, just be real. And if you want to continue deep conversations like this, follow the channel. Here, we don't seek quick answers, but a slow, deep understanding enough to change how we see ourselves and the world around us. Thank you for listening. Now, bye boo bids farewell and see you again.